Imagine being told that somewhere above the sky, standing closer to the throne of God than any other created being, is someone who used to be exactly what you are right now. Not a being formed from fire, not a creature spoken into existence before the foundations of the world, a man, a husband, a father, someone who walked on ordinary ground, breathed ordinary air, and lived an ordinary life for the first 365 years of his existence, before something happened to him that has never been fully explained and has never stopped being argued about. His name, before it changed, was Enoch. His name, after it changed, was Metatron, and the space between those two names holds one of the strangest, most debated, and most quietly explosive stories in the entire Jewish mystical tradition, a story so sensitive that one of the greatest rabbis who ever lived is said to have lost his faith entirely after glimpsing it, a story that forced later teachers to add warnings and qualifications around it, a story that some mystics considered too dangerous for ordinary students to even hear. Today, we are going to walk through the complete account of Metatron, from his beginnings as a mortal man who simply refused to stop walking with God, to his transformation into what later tradition calls the Prince of the Countenance, the angel who sits beside the throne, the scribe of heaven, the being some texts call the lesser YHWH. We are going to look at why his name is so strange that scholars still cannot agree on what it means, why his existence created a theological crisis that Jewish authorities had to actively suppress, and why, according to certain traditions, he was once punished so severely that he was struck with 60 lashes of fire in front of the very court he served. Before we start, if this kind of deep dive into the texts your Bible study never covered is the kind of thing you find valuable, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually mean it. And as always, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is right there for you. It genuinely amazes me how far this community reaches. All right, let's begin. The man who walked with God. Before there was a Metatron, there was Enoch. And to understand what he became, we first have to understand how strange he already was as a human being. The book of Genesis gives us most of its early genealogies in a single repeated formula. A man is born, he lives a certain number of years, he has children, he lives more years, and then, without exception, the passage ends with the same 4 words, and he died. Adam lived, and he died. Seth lived, and he died. Even Methuselah, the longest living human being in the entire Bible, gets the same closing line after his 969 years, and he died. Enoch's entry breaks the pattern. Genesis tells us that Enoch lived 365 years. That number alone would have caught the attention of an ancient reader, since it mirrors the days of a solar year, and Enoch would later become associated in extra-biblical tradition with calendars, astronomy, and the movement of the heavens. But the real anomaly isn't the number. It's what happens at the end of his life, or rather, what doesn't happen. Genesis says Enoch walked with God, and he was not. For God took him. He was not. Not he died. Not, and he was buried. He simply was not. One moment Enoch was present in the world, according to the tradition. The next, he had been taken, and the text refuses to elaborate on where or how or what that taking actually involved. For a document that is otherwise almost mechanically consistent in reporting the deaths of every single patriarch, this silence is deafening. Ancient readers noticed it immediately. Something had happened to Enoch that had never happened to anyone else, not even to the righteous men who came before him. He hadn't simply been a good man who pleased God. The text says he walked with God, a phrase used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible almost exclusively to describe an intimate, ongoing relationship. Not a single act of obedience, but a lifelong posture, a man in continuous close company with the divine. This detail, small as it looks on the page, became one of the most fertile seeds in the entire history of Jewish and later Christian speculation. If Enoch didn't die like everyone else, where did he go? If God simply took him, what did that taking look like? And if he continued to exist somewhere beyond ordinary human experience, what did he become there? It's worth noticing how brief the entire account actually is. In the Hebrew text, Enoch's story occupies a grand total of 2 verses. 2 verses for a figure who would eventually accumulate more speculative literature than almost any other character in the entire Hebrew Bible, outside of the most central patriarchs and prophets. Compare that to the extended narratives given to Abraham or Joseph or Moses, chapters upon chapters of dialogue, conflict, and detail. Enoch gets a genealogical entry and a single startling anomaly buried inside it. And somehow that anomaly proved more generative, more capable of producing centuries of downstream tradition than almost anything else in the ancient text. Ancient interpreters seem to have sensed that this brevity was not an accident, but an invitation, a gap this deliberate in a text this otherwise careful about its formulas, read less like an oversight and more like a locked door with no explanation of what lay behind it. And across the following centuries, one community after another would attempt to pick that lock. The book of Genesis will not answer these questions, but other texts written centuries later, texts that Jewish communities during the Second Temple period treasured and studied even though they never made it into the final biblical canon, decided to answer them anyway, and in extraordinary detail. The Book of Enoch, the same collection of writings that describes the fall of the Watchers and the binding of Azazel in the wilderness, opens with Enoch himself as the central figure. A righteous man, taken up into the heavens while still alive, shown the secrets of the cosmos by angels, and commissioned to record what he witnessed for the benefit of future generations. In that tradition, Enoch becomes a kind of cosmic tourist, walking through the storehouses of the winds, the chambers where souls await judgment, the paths of the sun and moon, and the throne room of God itself. Other Second Temple period writings built on this same foundation in their own ways. The Book of Jubilees, another text treasured by certain ancient Jewish communities, though never absorbed into the mainstream biblical canon, describes Enoch as the first among mortals to learn writing, knowledge, and wisdom, and credits him with recording the signs of the heavens in a book according to the order of their months, so that the sons of men might know the seasons of the years. In this telling, Enoch isn't just a righteous man taken up bodily, he's practically the founder of written record-keeping itself, the first scribe, the first astronomer, the first person entrusted with translating the movement of the heavens into something future generations could actually read and use. Jubilees goes further still, describing Enoch as having been placed by God as a witness against all the children of men, someone whose testimony would matter at the final judgment, and describing him as dwelling in the Garden of Eden, in majesty and honor, even while the rest of humanity remained locked outside its gates following the fall. Already, centuries before Enoch was composed, the tradition was assembling the raw materials for what would eventually become the Metatron story. A righteous scribe, a witness, a figure who occupies sacred space that ordinary mortals cannot reach. A man positioned, quite literally, on the threshold between the human and the divine. But it is a much later collection of writings, a text scholars call 3 Enoch, or the Hebrew Book of Enoch, likely compiled sometime between the 5th and 6th centuries within circles of Jewish mystics who studied what is known as Merkabah mysticism, the mysticism of the divine chariot throne that takes the story to its most radical conclusion. In this account, Enoch isn't merely shown the heavens. He doesn't return to earth to write down what he saw and then die a mortal death like everyone else. In this account, Enoch never comes back at all. He is transformed body and soul into an angel, not just any angel, the greatest of them. His new name is Metatron, the Ascension and the Transformation. According to thread Enoch, the account is delivered in the first person through the voice of Rabbi Ishmael, a sage said to have ascended into the heavenly palaces himself and to have met Metatron face to face during that journey. Through this frame, the text describes Metatron narrating his own origin story directly, explaining to Rabbi Ishmael exactly how a man became the being now standing before him. Metatron explains that in the generation of the flood, when humanity had become so thoroughly corrupted that the earth itself groaned under the weight of violence, God chose to remove Enoch from among mortals before judgment fell. He was lifted on the wings of the divine presence, carried upward through the heavens, past the layers of sky, where storms and stars and celestial waters were held in their appointed places, until he arrived before the throne itself. And there, according to the text, his body began to change. The transformation described in 3 Enoch is almost violent in its intensity. Enoch's flesh is said to have been turned into flame, his veins into fire, his bones into burning coals, his eyelashes into flashes of lightning, his eyeballs into fiery torches. The text describes his entire physical form being remade at a scale and substance appropriate to his new surroundings, because no ordinary human body, however righteous the soul inside it, could stand unaltered in the presence of the throne. Whatever Enoch had been before, he could not remain that and also become what he was becoming. Alongside this physical transformation came an expansion in scale that is almost impossible to picture. The text claims that Metatron's body was enlarged until it matched the size of the world itself, that wings sprouted from his shoulders, wings so vast the text says they equal the expanse of the entire earth, and that 36 wings unfolded on each of his sides, along with countless eyes. It's worth pausing here to say plainly that this material sits far outside anything found in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. This is Jewish mystical literature, composed by specific communities, exploring specific theological questions, centuries after the biblical texts were finished. It never became mainstream religious doctrine in the way that, say, the Ten Commandments did, but its influence on later Jewish mysticism, on medieval Cabbalah, and on how generations of readers imagined the architecture of heaven has been enormous, and that influence is exactly why this figure is still worth understanding. The text lingers on this transformation in a way that feels almost designed to overwhelm a listener rather than simply inform them. It isn't described as a single instantaneous flash, a before and an after separated by nothing. It reads more like a process, an unmaking and a remaking happening in sequence, as though the text wants its audience to understand just how total the change actually was. Nothing of the original Enoch, in the most literal physical sense, is described as surviving intact. The body that had walked the earth for 365 years, that had eaten and slept and aged and fathered children, is described as having been entirely reconstituted into something built for a different order of existence altogether. And yet, remarkably, the text insists that something continuous did survive the transformation, not the body, but the identity. Metatron, throughout 3 Enoch, still refers to himself as Enoch. He still remembers his mortal life. He still recounts, apparently with something like nostalgia, the specific circumstances of his ascension, naming the very generation and the very crisis, the corruption before the flood, that prompted God to remove him from the earth in the first place. Whatever else changed, whatever else burned away in that transformation, the text wants us to understand that the self at the center of it endured. There is one more detail worth mentioning here, because it captures something poignant about how the text imagines this new existence. Despite everything Metatron becomes, despite the crown and the throne and the 70 names, 3 Enoch also records that he carries a much humbler title among the highest angels of heaven. They are said to call him Nar, a Hebrew word simply meaning youth or lad. Various explanations are offered within the tradition for why the greatest of all angels would carry such a modest nickname, some suggesting it reflects his comparative newness among beings who have existed since before the dawn of creation. Others suggesting it preserves, in a single word, the plain fact that he alone among all the princes of heaven had once been, and in some sense still is, a human being who grew up, who was once, quite literally, a boy. Once the transformation was complete, according to the account, God is said to have given Enoch, now Metatron, an extraordinary series of gifts. A throne of his own, positioned outside the curtain that veils the divine presence, a privilege granted to no other being in heaven. A royal crown, 70 names, one for every nation on earth, symbolizing dominion over the affairs of all humanity. And most strikingly, the text says, God placed his own name upon Metatron, a shortened form of the divine name itself, so that Metatron came to be called by later tradition the lesser YHWH. Sit with that title for a moment, because it is the single most theologically loaded phrase in the entire Metatron tradition, and it is the phrase that would eventually get this figure into serious trouble. What does the name actually mean? Just like Azazel, just like so many figures who occupy the strange border regions of biblical and post-biblical tradition, the name Metatron arrives in the texts without explanation. No verse defines it. No angel introduces himself with an etymology. The name simply appears, fully formed, as though the original audience needed no introduction, and scholars have been arguing about its origin for more than 1,000 years without reaching a consensus. One of the oldest and most widely repeated theories holds that Metatron derives from Greek, specifically from a word combining meta, meaning beside or with, and thronos, meaning throne. Under this reading, the name essentially means the one beside the throne, or he who is with the throne, a fitting title for a being whose defining feature across nearly every text that mentions him is his proximity to the seat of God. This theory has the advantage of matching the actual role Metatron plays throughout the literature. Wherever he appears, he is stationed near the throne, serving as the connective tissue between the divine presence and everything beneath it. A second theory proposes a Latin origin, from metator, a term used for a measurer or a guide, specifically the kind of official in the Roman military and administrative system responsible for marking out the boundaries of a camp or measuring land. Under this reading, Metatron becomes something like the one who marks boundaries or the one who guides, which resonates with traditions describing him as the guide who leads souls through the heavenly realms and the angel responsible for maintaining cosmic order. A third, more mystical theory connects the name to the Hebrew root for guardian or keeper, positioning Metatron primarily as a watchman, the sentinel standing at the threshold between the created world and the fullness of divine glory, protecting the boundary that lesser beings, whether angel or human, are forbidden to cross without permission. There is also a numerological tradition, common in later Kabbalistic circles, that finds significance in the fact that when the Hebrew letters of Metatron's name are assigned their numerical values, the total equals the same value as one of the divine names associated with the Almighty, specifically Shaddai. In the mystical framework where numbers were believed to encode hidden relationships between concepts, this equivalence was taken as confirmation that Metatron and the divine name were bound together at the deepest structural level. That the connection wasn't just poetic, but mathematically embedded into the fabric of the text itself. None of these theories has ever definitively won out over the others, and honestly, that persistent ambiguity fits the character. Just as with Azazel, the uncertainty surrounding Metatron's name mirrors the uncertainty surrounding his very nature. Is he an angel who happens to serve near the throne, or something closer to an extension of the throne itself? Is he a guide, a guardian, a measurer of boundaries, or a being who represents divine authority so completely that he can, in some sense, stand in for it? The name refuses to settle the question, and so does most of the literature that follows it. What we can say clearly is that whatever the etymology, the title tradition eventually settled around him, Prince of the Countenance, Sar Hapanim in Hebrew, is unambiguous about his function. The countenance refers to the face of God, the fullness of the divine presence that no created being can look upon and survive. The Prince of the Countenance is the one who stands closest to that unbearable brightness, close enough to be scorched by it, close enough to mediate it to everyone standing farther back. The roles of heaven's highest angel. Across the various strands of this tradition, Metatron accumulates an almost overwhelming list of responsibilities, more than perhaps any other angelic figure in Jewish literature. He is described first and foremost as the heavenly scribe, the recorder who sits and writes down the merits and the deeds of Israel, maintaining the great ledger of human conduct that will eventually be consulted in judgment. This role connects directly back to the earthly Enoch, who, according to the earlier Enochic literature, was already famous as a scribe of righteousness even before his ascension, a man whose writing hand was trusted enough by the divine court that death itself couldn't be allowed to end his work. Heaven, in this tradition, simply promoted him. He is also described as the guide of souls, the angel responsible for leading the spirits of the righteous through the heavenly chambers after death, and in some traditions, specifically, the one who transports the soul of a person at the very moment of death from the material world into the world above. This role positions him at one of the most intimate thresholds imaginable, the exact boundary between a human life and whatever comes after it. He is called the Prince of the World in some texts, a title suggesting authority over the affairs of nations and history itself, the angel through whom divine governance of earthly events is administered. This is connected to the 70 names given to him, one for each of the traditional 70 nations descending from Noah's sons, implying that Metatron's influence touches the destiny of every people on earth, not merely Israel. He is described as the teacher of heavenly wisdom to young souls who ascend, the one who explains the secrets of the chariot and the structure of the cosmos to mystics who manage to travel upward, as Rabbi Ishmael is said to have done in Enoch. In this role, Metatron becomes something like the head instructor of Heaven's Academy, patiently walking visiting sages through architecture that would otherwise be completely incomprehensible to a mortal mind. And perhaps most significantly, across nearly every strand of the tradition, he is described as the intermediary through whom prayers ascend to God, the being who gathers the petitions of Israel and carries them upward through the heavenly courts to the throne, weaving them, according to some texts, into a crown of prayer that is presented before the divine presence itself. Beyond these individual duties, the Hekkalot literature more broadly assigns Metatron a kind of supervisory role over the architecture of heaven itself. The tradition describes 7 heavenly palaces, nested one within another, each guarded by ranks of fierce angelic gatekeepers who challenge any soul or mystic attempting to pass, demanding the correct seals, the correct divine names, the correct proof that the traveler has been granted permission to proceed. Any mystic who arrives at a gate without the proper credentials, the tradition warns, risks not simply being turned away, but being destroyed outright by the guardians stationed there. Within this structure, Metatron is frequently described as the figure with authority over the entire process, the one who instructs Rabbi Ishmael on exactly which names and seals will be required at each successive threshold, effectively serving as both tour guide and gatekeeper-in-chief for the whole ascent. He's also credited in some traditions with having personally taught Moses during his 40 days on Mount Sinai, transmitting to him the deeper, hidden dimensions of the law that lay beneath its plain written text, a role that would later be picked up and expanded considerably within Kabbalistic literature, where Metatron increasingly comes to be associated with the transmission of esoteric wisdom generally, not merely the architecture of the heavens, but the inner meaning of Scripture itself. Taken together, these roles paint a picture of a figure functioning almost as a kind of chief of staff for the entirety of creation, managing the flow of information, souls, prayers, and judgment between the world below and the throne above. No other angel in the literature carries anywhere near this concentration of overlapping duties. It is precisely this concentration of power, this sense that Metatron sits so close to the function of God that the line between angel and deity starts to blur, that eventually produces the single most dramatic episode in the entire tradition, the story of Aher and the two powers in heaven. There is a passage preserved in the Talmud, specifically in Tractate Hagigah, that tells the story of 4 sages who ascended into what the rabbinic tradition calls Pardes, a Hebrew word meaning orchard or garden, used here as a metaphor for the deepest and most dangerous level of mystical contemplation, essentially a guided journey into the highest heavenly realms while still alive. 4 men entered. The text tells us their names: Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Elisha ben Abuya, and Rabbi Akiva, one of the most revered sages in the entire history of rabbinic Judaism. Of the 4, the text says only Akiva emerged whole. Ben Azai looked and died. Ben Zoma looked and lost his mind. Elisha ben Abuya looked and, in the language of the text, cut the shoots, a phrase later interpreted to mean that he became a heretic, that he turned away from the faith of his fathers entirely. Later Jewish tradition would come to refer to him not by his own name, but by the bitter nickname Aher, meaning simply the other, as if his former identity had been erased along with his faith. Later commentary, expanding significantly on the brief Talmudic account, explains what exactly Elisha ben Abuya is said to have seen that shattered him so completely. According to this tradition, during his ascent into the heavenly palaces, Elisha looked up and saw a figure seated on a throne, a privilege the text says was granted to no being in heaven except God alone, the right to sit rather than stand in the divine presence. And there, sitting, was Metatron. Elisha's mind, according to the tradition, leapt immediately to the most theologically catastrophic conclusion available to a monotheistic sage. If there is a second figure seated on a throne in heaven, then perhaps, he reasoned, there are 2 powers governing the universe, not one. This idea, known in later rabbinic literature as the heresy of 2 powers in heaven, represented one of the gravest possible violations of Jewish monotheism, a direct assault on the foundational claim that God's authority is absolute, singular, and shared with no one. The tradition tells us that heaven itself had to respond immediately and decisively to prevent this misunderstanding from spreading. Metatron, the text says, was taken down from his throne and struck with 60 lashes of fire, a punishment inflicted specifically to demonstrate to any who might learn of it that Metatron was not a co-ruler of the cosmos, not a second divine power, but a created being, an angel, however exalted, who remained entirely subordinate to God and who could be disciplined exactly like any other servant of the heavenly court. The text goes further, offering an explanation for why Metatron had been sitting in the first place, a detail the tradition treats as almost mitigating. though not enough to spare him the punishment. Metatron, it says, had been granted permission to sit only because his ongoing task, at that specific moment, was recording the merits of Israel, and the sheer volume of righteous deeds requiring documentation was so immense that he needed to remain seated simply to keep pace with the writing. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't an attempt to claim divine status for himself. It was, in this reading, simply an angel doing his job in the most practical way available to him. And still, the appearance of it, the mere sight of a throned figure beside the throne of God, was dangerous enough that it had to be publicly and painfully corrected. Elisha ben Abuya, according to the broader traditions surrounding him, never recovered from what he had witnessed. He is remembered in later Jewish literature as having abandoned religious observance entirely, associating instead with the surrounding Greco-Roman culture, and the tradition preserves a poignant final detail. His former student, Rabbi Meir, is said to have remained loyal to him even after his teacher's fall from faith, continuing to visit him and learn from him even while the wider rabbinic community distanced itself from Aher's memory. The story stands as one of the most human and tragic episodes in the entire body of Jewish mystical literature, a cautionary tale about how easily even a brilliant, devoted mind can be broken by an experience too vast for it to safely hold. The rabbinic tradition surrounding this episode makes one more point worth dwelling on, because it reveals just how seriously the ancient authorities took the theological stakes involved. The concern was never really about Metatron's actual status, since the whole point of the punishment was to reaffirm what his status had been all along: a created servant, however magnificent, entirely subordinate to the one throne that mattered. The concern was about perception, about what a partial glimpse of something vast could do to a mind that filled in the rest of the picture incorrectly. Jewish tradition would go on to treat the phrase "two powers in heaven" as a kind of shorthand for one of the most serious theological errors imaginable. And later, rabbinic literature shows real anxiety about any text, any teaching, any mystical account that might, even accidentally, lend support to that reading. Some scholars have suggested that portions of the Hekkelot literature itself may have been shaped, revised, or hedged over time specifically in response to this anxiety, adding qualifying statements and reminders of Metatron's created nature precisely because the tradition surrounding him kept brushing up against a line its own teachers were desperate not to cross. This episode is why later teachers approached the entire subject of Metatron, and the broader discipline of Merkabah mysticism generally, with such extraordinary caution. It wasn't that the material was considered false. It was that the material was considered dangerous, capable of unraveling the theological foundations of anyone who engaged with it without sufficient preparation, sufficient humility, or sufficient guidance. Later, rabbinic authorities would place strict restrictions on who was permitted to study these texts at all, often limiting serious instruction in mystical literature to married men over the age of 40, individuals judged to have the emotional and intellectual stability to encounter these ideas without being shattered by them the way Elisha ben Abuya had been. Sandalphon, the twin beside him. If you've spent any time exploring this kind of material before, you may have already come across another towering angelic figure who is frequently paired with Metatron, sometimes described as his brother, sometimes as his twin. His name is Sandalphon. According to a significant strand of Jewish mystical tradition, Sandalphon shares an origin story remarkably similar to Metatron's own. Just as Enoch was a righteous man taken up bodily and transformed into an angel, Sandalphon is identified in this tradition with the prophet Elijah, another biblical figure whose death the text pointedly refuses to record. 2 Kings describes Elijah being carried into heaven in a whirlwind, in a chariot of fire while still alive, witnessed by his disciple Elisha, who cries out as his master ascends beyond his sight. No burial, no closing formula of death. Just as with Enoch, the narrative simply removes him from the world of mortals without ever describing an end. According to this tradition, Elijah, like Enoch centuries before him, was transformed upon his ascension into an angelic being, and that being became Sandalphon, standing alongside Metatron as one of the two mortal men elevated to the highest ranks of the heavenly hierarchy. The two among all of humanity granted the extraordinary and almost unrepeatable privilege of never tasting death at all. The pairing carries thematic weight beyond mere narrative symmetry, where Metatron is frequently described as standing before the throne, associated with light, fire, and the recording of deeds. Sandalphon is often described in the tradition as standing behind it or beneath it, associated with a different set of tasks, most notably weaving the prayers of Israel into garlands or crowns and presenting them upward toward the divine presence, a role that overlaps with, and in some texts complements, Metatron's own function as the one who carries petitions between earth and heaven. Some mystical sources describe Sandalphon as being of such immense stature that it would take 500 years just to walk the height of him, an image meant to convey not literal physical size in any ordinary sense, but the almost incomprehensible scale separating a heavenly being of this rank from anything human experience can normally hold. Between the two of them, Metatron and Sandalphon represent something genuinely unique within the broader landscape of angelology across the Abrahamic traditions. Angels who were once unmistakably human beings, walking the same earth as everyone else before something happened that took them beyond it entirely. Merkabah mysticism and the literature behind the legend. To understand why a figure like Metatron could emerge at all, it helps to understand the movement that produced him. Beginning sometime around the first few centuries of the Common Era and continuing for several centuries afterward, certain circles within Judaism developed an intense mystical discipline centered on the vision described in the opening chapter of the book of Ezekiel. The prophet's overwhelming account of a chariot throne, wheels within wheels, 4 living creatures, and a blinding, fiery human-like form seated above it all. This discipline came to be called Merkabah mysticism, from the Hebrew word for chariot, and its practitioners developed elaborate techniques of fasting, prayer, and meditative preparation aimed at achieving something extraordinary. A guided ascent of the soul through 7 heavenly palaces, or hecalot, culminating in a vision of the divine throne itself. The literature these circles produced, collectively known as the hecalot literature, describes these ascents in vivid, sometimes overwhelming detail, cataloguing the names of the angelic guardians stationed at each gate, the passwords and seals required to pass them safely, and the dangers awaiting any mystic unprepared for what lay ahead. 3 Enoch, the text at the heart of the Metatron tradition, is generally considered by scholars to be one of the latest and most developed works in this body of literature, likely reaching something close to its final form between the 5th and 6th centuries, though drawing on older traditions that had circulated for generations before being written down in this particular arrangement. Within this framework, Metatron functions as something like the master key to the entire system, the angel who has himself already completed the journey every subsequent mystic hopes to make, and who now stands ready to explain the architecture of heaven to those who follow, exactly as the text portrays him doing for Rabbi Ishmael. It's worth being clear about something here, in the same spirit of honesty that should apply to any story, this old and this contested. This material was never uniformly accepted across the whole of Jewish tradition. Some authorities embraced hecalot and Merkabah literature as a legitimate, if extremely advanced and restricted branch of religious knowledge. Others viewed it with deep suspicion, precisely because of stories like the fall of Elisha ben Abuya, worried that speculation of this kind carried real theological risk for anyone not spiritually equipped to handle it. The tradition of restricting its study to a narrow, carefully vetted group of scholars reflects that ongoing tension. This was never simple, universally agreed upon doctrine. It was, and remains, a specialized and often controversial current within a much larger and more diverse religious tradition. Into Cabbalah and beyond, the figure of Metatron didn't remain confined to the Hekkalot literature. As Jewish mysticism continued to develop into the medieval period, eventually crystallizing into the sprawling system known as Cabbalah, Metatron was absorbed into these newer frameworks and given fresh layers of meaning. Within later Kabbalistic literature, Metatron is frequently identified with a specific position or emanation within the mystical structure used to describe how the infinite divine reality manifests itself into the created world, often being associated with the sphere nearest to the boundary between the fully divine and the created realms. The exact threshold position his name and his story had always suggested. Some Kabbalistic sources go so far as to describe Metatron as functioning almost like the created world's internal representative of divine governance, the point through which the will of God is translated into forms that lower levels of creation can actually receive and act upon. He also appears with some frequency in later Jewish folklore and popular tradition, sometimes cast as the angel who taught Moses, sometimes described as the guardian who watches over children, sometimes invoked in protective amulets and charms meant to ward off harm. Over the centuries, the austere, almost overwhelming figure described in 3 Enoch, wrapped in fire, spanning the width of the world, punished for merely appearing to sit too close to God, gradually took on gentler, more accessible characteristics in popular imagination, even as the older, more dangerous version of his story continued to circulate among serious students of the mystical tradition. Some scholars studying the broader history of religious thought in this period have also pointed out intriguing parallels between the role Metatron plays in Jewish mysticism and the role played by the concept of the Logos, the divine word, in early Christian theology, particularly in the opening of the Gospel of John, which describes a divine word that was with God, and through which all things were made. Both concepts, emerging from related but distinct religious communities in roughly overlapping historical periods, wrestle with a similar underlying problem. How can an utterly transcendent, singular God interact directly with a limited, physical creation without compromising that transcendence? Both traditions arrive at some version of an intermediary figure, standing at the threshold between the infinite and the finite, close enough to the divine to carry its full authority, distinct enough from it to actually meet creation partway. It's a reminder that the theological puzzle Metatron was invented to help solve wasn't unique to the mystics who told his story. It was a live question across multiple religious communities, wrestling with the same basic tension at roughly the same moment in history. In the modern era, Metatron has traveled even further from his origins, showing up across an enormous range of popular fiction, films, television, video games, and fantasy literature, almost always stripped of the specific theological weight that originally defined him. In most of these modern portrayals, he survives mainly as a generically powerful archangel, often functioning as a messenger or voice of God, a distant echo of the Prince of the Countenance described in the Hekkalot texts, but rarely carrying any trace of the specific and genuinely startling claim that first made him significant, that he was once, entirely and completely, an ordinary human being. The Prince of the Torah and the folk tradition, alongside the towering, almost frightening figure described in 3 Enoch, another strand of tradition developed around a somewhat gentler function attributed to Metatron, one that made him far more accessible to ordinary religious life than the fire-wrapped Prince of the Countenance ever could be. This is the tradition of Metatron as Sar HaTorah, the Prince of the Torah, an angel whose intercession could be sought through carefully prescribed rituals of fasting, purification, and prayer to grant a struggling student extraordinary memory and comprehension of sacred texts. Texts belonging to this tradition, sometimes classified alongside the broader Hekkalot corpus, describe elaborate procedures a student might undertake, invoking Metatron's name alongside a sequence of other angelic names, to be granted what the texts describe as an infusion of wisdom, capable of transforming an ordinary, struggling mind into one capable of mastering the entirety of Jewish law and its interpretation. Whatever the historical reality behind these practices, and scholars remain divided on how literally or widely they were ever actually performed, their existence tells us something important about how Metatron's image evolved over time. The being who was struck down with 60 lashes of fire for the mere appearance of overreaching his station gradually became, in the eyes of ordinary religious communities centuries later, someone approachable enough to ask for help with something as human and as everyday as struggling to memorize a difficult text. This softer image continued to develop across the medieval period. Metatron appears with some regularity in Jewish folk literature and in the tradition of protective amulets, invoked alongside other archangels for the protection of children, for safety during travel, for warding off illness or misfortune. Some folk traditions associated with childbirth specifically call upon Metatron for protection during one of the most vulnerable moments in ancient life, an application that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the authors of 3 Enoch, for whom Metatron represented something closer to an overwhelming cosmic mystery than a comforting household protector. It's a pattern worth noticing, because it recurs across a great deal of religious history. A figure originates in an elite, restricted, deeply esoteric context, understood fully by only a small circle of specially trained scholars, surrounded by warnings about its danger and its difficulty. And then, gradually, pieces of that figure filter downward into popular religious imagination, losing much of their original complexity and danger along the way, but gaining something else in exchange, a kind of everyday usefulness, a place in the actual devotional lives of people who would never have had access to or interest in the original mystical texts. Metatron's journey from the throne room, described in 3 Enoch, to a name inscribed on a protective amulet for a newborn child, is, in miniature, the story of how esoteric religious ideas so often make their way into ordinary life. There is also a persistent thread of tradition, appearing in various forms across medieval Jewish literature, that positions Metatron as a kind of heavenly librarian, the keeper of secrets pertaining to the future, to the hidden meanings of Scripture, and in some accounts to the exact date of the final redemption of the world. This aspect of the tradition fed directly into later Kabbalistic speculation, where figures seeking insight into the deeper structure of history and the timing of messianic events sometimes framed their inquiries as attempts to access knowledge Metatron himself was understood to hold, guarded closely, and revealed only rarely, and only to those judged worthy of receiving it. Why this story still matters. There's a reason the story of Metatron has continued circulating for over 1,000 years, quietly influencing Jewish mysticism, occasionally surfacing in popular culture, and still generating genuine fascination whenever someone encounters it for the first time. It isn't really a story about angels at all, not fundamentally. It's a story about the outer edge of what a human life might become. Every other figure in this kind of angelic tradition, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, even the fallen watchers like Azazel and Shemhazai, begins as something other than human, a being created directly for the heavenly realm who either serves faithfully or falls into rebellion. Metatron is different. Metatron begins exactly where every person listening to this begins, as a man living an ordinary span of years, having children, presumably experiencing the same frustrations, the same small joys, the same daily texture of an ancient life that every other person in his generation experienced. The text tells us only one thing distinguished him, one simple, almost deceptively modest phrase: he walked with God. Not that he performed some singular heroic act, not that he built an ark, or led a nation, or received tablets of law on a mountaintop. Just that he walked continuously, faithfully, for the entirety of an unusually long life, in close company with the divine, until eventually, according to this tradition, the walking itself became a kind of transformation, and the boundary between the man and the glory he had spent his whole life walking beside simply dissolved. Whether or not you find the specific claims of 3 Enoch, the fire, the wings spanning the width of the earth, the throne beside the throne, historically or theologically credible, is, in the end, a question each reader has to sit with for themselves. But the underlying shape of the story, a life of sustained, quiet faithfulness, eventually opening into something far larger than the person who lived it ever could have anticipated, is a shape that has resonated across an enormous span of religious history for a reason. And there's something worth sitting with in the story's darker turn as well, in the fall of Elisha ben Abuya, because that half of the story is really a warning about a very different kind of danger, the danger of encountering something vast and concluding too quickly that you fully understand what you've seen. Elisha looked at a seated figure beside the throne, and in an instant restructured his entire understanding of the universe around a single fragment of an image. Heaven's response wasn't to punish him for looking. It was to correct the record immediately and unmistakably, because an incomplete glimpse of something enormous, left unexamined, has the power to reshape a person's entire life, for better or for catastrophically for worse. Metatron himself, in the tradition, never asked for a throne. He never asked for 70 names or a portion of the divine name placed upon him. According to the account, all of it was given, a consequence of faithfulness sustained over centuries, rather than a prize sought after. And when the appearance of that gift was misread by someone else as something it was never meant to be, it was Metatron, not the man who misunderstood him, who bore the immediate correction, 60 lashes of fire, a public reminder that proximity to glory, however great, is never the same thing as possessing it. The man who once simply walked became, according to this ancient and strange and carefully guarded tradition, the being who stands closest to everything. The scribe who records what humanity does with its days. The guide who meets the soul at the final threshold. The one seated, if only briefly and only for the sake of his work, beside a throne no other creature was ever permitted to approach so closely. Whatever you make of the specifics, the fire, the wings, the 70 names, the story leaves behind a question worth carrying with you long after the text itself falls silent. Not what would it take to become an angel, but what would it look like over the span of an entire lifetime to simply keep walking faithfully, quietly, day after ordinary day, in the direction of something greater than yourself. If you found this exploration of one of Judaism's most fascinating and lesser-known mystical traditions valuable, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if there's another hidden figure from these ancient texts you'd like unpacked next. There are still so many stories waiting in these old pages, and we've really only just begun.